Inga, hi, good afternoon. Good to see you.
Yes, you too. It's been a while.
It has. Well, you've been in Iceland, haven't you, for the
I
last
did.
X amount of months?
Yes,
So
I
you
spent
went,
4 months. Yeah, almost April, May, June, July. Yeah, quite a while. I escaped lockdown about a week into lockdown, and I had been working from home at that point for 2 weeks. Realized that that was not going to be a good place, given that we could see on the horizon that things were going to be worse than people were talking, and that initial 5-6 weeks lockdown was probably going to be extended. So I got one of the few flights that were still flying out on the 30th of March. It was quite a surreal experience to fly through Heathrow on that date, and I've flown through Heathrow during shoe bomber and no liquids and no luggage and all of that. So I literally flown out of Heathrow on those type of days. So I've been through a few strange ones, but yes, everything was closed. The departure boards didn't even fill the normal 3 pages that they normally scroll through. It was quite eerie. It was quite eerie.
and what was it like arriving in Iceland?
Really, actually, it didn't feel so different. I mean, I had to go into self-isolation for 2 weeks. The Icelandic government issued that directive from the 18th of March that anyone arriving in Iceland, whether you lived in Iceland and returning from a holiday, or if you were like me, a foreign Icelander but foreign resident, then you had to be in self-isolation for 2 weeks. You were allowed to go out for a solitary exercise once a day or twice a day, but you could not go grocery shopping, you could not meet other people, except perhaps with at least the 2-meter distance, but it was just safer to keep to myself. I borrowed a dog to keep me company for 2 weeks.
And it was quite, if I remember rightly, it was actually quite snowy still, wasn't
yes,
it? Yes,
yes. The first weekend I was back, it was quite a bad snowstorm. So we had quite a lot of snow, and the dog had little feet, so he kept getting stuck. Yeah, but it was good to have the excuse to leave the house a couple of times a day.
Now, Iceland is one of those countries that everyone knows, but no one knows, if it makes any sense.
True. Yes, I think so. I think a lot of people know a lot more. I think the economic crash in 2008, of course, puts it on the global map. But even more so, I think the volcanic eruption with the unpronounceable Volcano back in spring of 2010.
Okay, well, let's go back to those days. 2008, obviously the crash. How did the country react to that period of time?
It was. I mean, I haven't lived there. I wasn't living there then, and I hadn't lived there since 1994. But it was a lot of anger. There was a lot of anger around that. There was actually protests in front of Parliament. There was. It felt a lot of people were very unhappy. They felt the elite was getting away with turning over businesses, that it had been a bubble, and everyone had been kind of sold the emperor's new clothes, for want of a better description.
Because Iceland suddenly became one of the richest country in the world, almost, didn't it?
Yes, I personally never quite understood how that happened. And when people ask me, "Oh, you in London working for Icelandic businesses?" No, I wasn't. I was one of the few, I think, Icelanders in London not working for an Icelandic business. But yes, it was a fast-paced growth that at that time I wasn't really paying attention. I was too focused on what I was doing myself. And
so you're at Lausanne school, weren't you, at the time, I think?
No, this was before then. I didn't go to Lausanne until 2010.
Oh, there we go.
So, but I was still working in London, and I was working for a business that meant I traveled in other directions. I was traveling in the Middle East and in the US, so I wasn't really paying much attention to what was going on in Iceland. Other than I always found it very strange that there were all these expensive, fancy cars when I went back, and my pounds were worth less and less every time I visited, which was quite painful.
And when people look back on that period now, how do they view that period?
I think it's incredible to think it's only been 12 years, and it took less than 10 years for the economy to be back at that pre-crisis level. There are still some court cases that are still dragging in terms of bankers that have been taken to court. Some have been to prison, served, and not just they had to actually go to prison, not just you call it non-custodial. They've been actually custodial sentences. So I think that has helped a bit, but there's still a little bit of in my view, a little bit of underlying bubbling kind of resentment that pops up every now and then.
And then, as you rightly say, the volcano followed obviously shortly after.
Yeah.
Which must have been quite devastating. The best thing.
Yes, because one of the things that obviously happened with the currency when we had the economic crash is that our currency crashed massively. So to give you an idea, 2007-8, £1 to the krona would have been about 115, something like that. At the height of the crash in October 2008, it was 220. It was a good time for me to buy gift certificates in Icelandic krona for Christmas. But yes, so that combined, and the currency then it balanced out a bit, but kind of the krona to the pound, 160 to 190, maybe hinting to 200, kind of that's where it's been for the last 10 years. And that helped because Iceland was very expensive and always is very expensive because of our social model and taxes, etc. But when the exchange rate was much more favorable, and that coincided with the volcano, suddenly became affordable, and the whole world suddenly wanted to know more about Iceland, and visiting in large groups, and the number of tourists, yes, have expanded exponentially since.
I know Iceland actually has really grown.
Last year was small shrinkage in the visitor numbers for the first time in 10 years.
Was there a reason for that?
Partly, again, the currency was getting stronger. Obviously, maybe a little bit of Iceland fatigue. And then that coincided also with, we had a low-cost airline that went bust in March last year. And that late in the season, in terms of ahead of the summer, there weren't necessarily, even there were slots available at the airport, weren't necessarily airlines going to grab those slots at such short notice for the summer season.
Okay. So how has Iceland looked at the whole COVID crisis?
I think they've, having looked at it from an outside and then staying there during the kind of height of it, and comparing it to constantly looking back to the UK, I felt the impact was very different to what's happening in the UK. Yes, economic impact is going to be quite dramatic because tourism is the biggest employer in terms of services and exports, etc. But from a day-to-day life, after I passed the 2-week self-isolation, that was kind of coincided with Easter weekend. And the weekend after, I went out for dinner to a restaurant with my parents. There was never a lockdown, but there were restrictions. So there couldn't be at that time and until early May, no more than 20 people in any particular space, including restaurants, cafes. And so as long as restaurants had the ability to segregate you, keep the social distance, and have guests and staff, no more than 20 people, they could still stay open.
We've talked about, sorry, up to you, please.
Yeah, so.
We talk about over here a lot, there's being a fear culture that seems to have evolved. Did you see this in Iceland?
No, it didn't feel like fear. The politicians did not get involved in the messaging or the updates around the virus. It was always handled by professionals. The politicians and the cabinet got involved when it came to, issuing from the Minister of Health new rules or new directives in terms of, okay, now you can't do this, or now you're allowed to have 50 people, or now gyms are allowed to open, those kind of things. But when it came to the daily news, what to do, what's happening, how many cases do we have, things like that, that was handled by professionals within the healthcare system. And it was attacked or presented in such a way that it was like, it's not them against us or them telling us what to do. It was more about, right, we're all in this together. We are all part of the solution. We are all part of making our way through this in the best possible way, which was all about social distance and hand washing and following, the guidance. It was not kind of, you must do this, which would never work on Icelandic people because they would have just done the opposite.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Now, how's it impacted on you personally? How does it,
It was very good to be back home, because once I was out of self-isolation, I stayed with my parents for a little bit, and then I stayed with my sister and her family, and therefore not being completely isolated and being able to be surrounded by other people. But also, once I was out of the self-isolation, I could still go, I could still go shopping. I could still go, for a run. Yes, gyms and hairdressers and salons, cinemas, those kind of areas were all closed until May. But I mean, hairdressers and salons opened 5th of May. Gyms opened 25th of May. Things were, the restrictions on crowds were eased fairly. I mean, they've now had to go backwards a bit because we've had another peak in late July, early August. So restrictions are more in place, but it's still not so that you can't go shopping or you can't do things. But you just have to be, the crowd restrictions have come down from being 200 to I think about 100 now, or there were 500 and now down to about 100. And the rule of 2 meters had become a guidance, but is now a strict, needs to be enforced, for instance. So, and suddenly, last few weeks, things like hairdressers and things like that have to wear masks, and you have to wear masks on public transport. But before now, until August, that was not the case. So,
you rightly say you haven't been there for quite a number of years. 1994,
no,
was it?
I hadn't spent this much time in Iceland since 2002. So I was there all of April, May, June, July, so 4 months. I mean, the first couple of months, I didn't really, I had my little family social bubble. I was just working, didn't really do much or see people, but kind of late May, early June, started to go out and still keeping, be careful, you hold your social distance, you don't socialize with a huge crowd of people, but doing things. So, I mean, it was nice to be out of London and being able to do things that are good for your physical and mental health outside of work, like, half an hour and you're driving and you can go for a hike and you do a 3-hour hike after dinner and then you come home and it just feels good. And being close to my family was nice. Yeah, definitely.
I can understand that. And did it change any of your perspectives when you're looking back on things or not?
Yes. Yeah, I think definitely need to be spending more time there. Obviously I didn't have any problems working remotely. I've been doing that for a long time anyway. It didn't really make a big difference apart from, yes, there were quite a lot more Zoom meetings and you had to make sure the dogs kept quiet and no one slamming doors, but that was the same as everyone else that was having Zoom meetings. So, but it made me appreciate being back in Europe for sure. I was glad I was back in Europe and had the ability to go back to Iceland at such short notice. I would not have wanted to be in London by myself for all that time in a lockdown. That would have been very bad, just because the social aspect of it would have been very difficult.
No, I can understand that. I suppose 2 questions. One, during this period, what changes have you noticed in Iceland?
Iceland is, compared to even 2002 and 94, Iceland is a lot more international. Like, I would be going somewhere and I would hear, even though it was closed to tourists, I would hear lots of other languages being spoken. There is now, when I left Iceland in 94, there would have been maybe 3% foreigners. Now it's more like 12%, I believe, of the total population. The biggest foreign born population is Polish, and you do hear a lot of Polish in different areas. So definitely, but there's a huge variety of and the culture in terms is much more international than it used to be.
How about
and suddenly the city has trees. It didn't have trees when I used to live there. They've suddenly grown.
That's good. And how about hospitality? How about the hotels and the restaurants and the resorts?
Very tough, very tough. Bars and clubs and things like that are not allowed to be open beyond midnight yet. And Icelandic culture is such that you go out like at 11. So the fact that they can only close, they have to close at midnight instead of 3 or 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, it's not the same. Number of hotels in Reykjavik are still closed because there aren't the visitors numbers that are expected. Early July, they were hoping that maybe a quarter the visitor numbers. They would get about a quarter of what they got in August last year would come in August this year. But now with the infection rates rising, I haven't heard the latest numbers. I don't think that's going to be it. Out in the country, the Icelandic government tried to encourage people, obviously, to travel domestically, and a lot of people have been doing that. And it's hard, having worked for so long in hospitality, or I've been touched by hospitality through my family, etc. But a lot of people are saying, oh, it's so nice to travel around Iceland and there are no tourists. We're having the country to ourselves. And you're like, yes, but you're not losing your job. And there are thousands of people that have been given notice and are about to lose their jobs if they haven't already lost their jobs. But yeah, so there's a lot of, suddenly Icelanders are staying in hotels out in the countryside, but then the yield is going to be very low. The rates are very low, but at least it's occupancy. And in Icelandic, people are more likely to be spending money on food and drink versus perhaps tourists would focus on, they're going to stay somewhere and then they go out and go and see things. Whereas Icelanders, like, okay, they've been in what in their view was a lockdown, which wasn't a lockdown compared to the UK. They want to just, okay, we want to enjoy it and celebrate and be good to ourselves. But what's going to happen in September? I mean, people back after holidays, back to work, back to school. That's really when the countryside is going to start being seriously hit, unfortunately.
And what are your views as we come out? What are your expectations we're going to see?
I think that it's going to continue to be like ebb and flow, up and down in terms of the numbers, and we all have our part to play to not get complacent with our social distance. But it's tough. People can't keep that. We're not meant to keep that social distance. We're social animals. It's going to be the longer this goes on, the harder it's going to be. And I think tourism will take a long time to recover.
And do you think there'll be a second spike?
Yes, definitely.
And a further lockdown? Do you expect that?
I hope not. I don't think a lockdown is going to be the solution. I know everyone's been looking at what Sweden's been doing, and in one way that was quite extreme. And other pieces, you think they're kind of leveling. So perhaps something in between what was done here and what Sweden did. There must be some middle ground in between. I don't think a lockdown is good. It's just mentally is not going to be good, and it's going to be awful for the economy as well. Whether it's here or in France or anywhere else. Because it's not going to solve it. It will just create other spikes. So we have to find some other ways of managing it.
So we talk about you for a second. Obviously, you've worked in London, you've worked in Jamaica, the Sandals Resort Group.
Yeah.
You've obviously worked in Europe and traveled all around the place.
Mm-hmm.
Your views over how hospitality has moved forward over the last decade?
I think everyone or a lot of people have been talking about overcrowding and with social media kind of hyping up certain locations over others. And Iceland's been a prime example. I mean, Instagram has been the biggest and best and cheapest marketing tool that has been invented for Iceland, because it's all about the landscape and the nature. Same thing, of course, you have things like Game of Thrones influence, people visiting Ireland or Iceland or Croatia and Malta, etc. So I think that's been the biggest change in terms of travel, is that suddenly far-flung places that very few people knew about, they aren't so secret and tranquil anymore. They can be quite overcrowded, which I think will change a bit for the short term anyway. I think that it is something that is good for the economy, and it is a way out of poverty for developing countries. It's critical. I can see the impact it has on economies when I was working in the Caribbean, and it just breaks my heart to think how difficult it must be for them, not just Jamaica, but Barbados, Bahamas, Grenada, etc., where they rely on it even to a greater extent than in Iceland.
I was going to say, Jamaica must be particularly, I mean, I don't know, but Jamaica must be struggling at this point in time.
I think it's like domestically, they're from what I hear from people I'm still in touch with, they are doing well. It's just the fact that the visitor numbers aren't coming, because it's for the Caribbean, it's especially that part of the Caribbean, it's North America, it's Canadians, it's Americans coming. And if the situation in so many places there is bad, not just the virus, but also the economic consequence. People are reluctant to travel, which is a shame, because I know the resorts, and not just Sandals, but others, have been doing a lot of hard work to protect their guests.
And what's it like being back in London now?
It's eerie. It really is eerie. It is very strange. Yes, I was at an office for 3 days last week, and even just taking the train at 8:30, 8:15, when I would normally have to really, squeeze myself on. It's very easy to keep the social distance. I walked across the bridge from Southwark into the city a couple of weeks ago on a Friday afternoon, and it was just empty. It just felt like something out of a movie.
No, it is very strange.
It is. I was down, even down on Oxford Street yesterday, very quiet, inside Selfridges, inside Westfield and Shepherd's Bush last week. It was so many retail outlets been boarded up. I think it was more, it was already coming for a lot of the retail, unfortunately, and this was one of the final nails for many. But yes, it's sad.
I mean, that's one of the comments, isn't it? Is this just fast forwarded lots of behavioural traits and change?
I think so. Yes, definitely.
I suppose one of the big discussion pieces over here is all about community. People rediscover community and localism.
Yes.
I assume in Iceland that's always been a very strong trait, isn't it? You always get
been a strong, yes, because it's so small. There's always been that strong community. There has been some conversation about lack of community, or the concern for non-Icelandic speakers during this crisis, and that access to information. Have they got access to the information in their own languages? If Icelandic is not an easy language to learn. And I have to admit, I've been quite impressed in terms of the speed at which information is. There's a special website. It is now in 6 or 7 different languages, with daily updates on infection rates, how many people in hospital, advice on what to do, guidance on the latest rules, things like that.
And how badly affected has Iceland been in the numbers?
We have 10 deaths out of about 2,000 confirmed cases. But we also had a very aggressive test and track and isolate program from very, very early days. We had a working track and trace app that people were encouraged to download from early April. And there was a large team assembled at the height, where people were as soon as if you were tested as confirmed case, they did a track and trace around you, and people that you've been in contact with were put into self-isolation for 2 weeks, and then they were monitored by a health professional over the phone or over Zoom, etc. And then if they were developing symptoms, they would have been tested to try to stop in the buzz, kind of those that you had been in contact with would then eventually start spreading, because there was so much of it that was asymptomatic. So,
I mean, people always refer to 2020 as the year that never took place.
Yes. Well, I think it won't be quite like that, but it will be the turning point for many things, I think, in terms of how we have to think differently and act differently.
I think that's right. But when you look back on this year, what's your greatest learning?
I think that appreciate what you have and what you've got close to you, like family, definitely. I am so grateful that I'm back and I'm closer to them. And even like now, the rules changed for Iceland. If I needed to go back now, I'd have to go back. I'd be tested on arrival. I'd have to be 5 days self-isolate, and then I'd be tested again before I'd be allowed to see anyone. But that's fine. That's a small price to pay, and I don't mind. That's 5 days compared to the 2 weeks I had before. But yes, knowing that closeness and that there are still flights and I can go. It would have been if I'd been in Jamaica, or if I'd been Singapore, Hong Kong, or somewhere else, it would have been that much harder, definitely.
And one of the, again, the same theme, going back on it again, one of the views are that there's a lot of learnings. People have changed perspective during this period of time. Lots of people have changed perspective. Do you think there's a good enough understanding by many businesses that just how much change is taking place? In
terms of travel, tourism, or just generally lifestyle?
Yeah, both actually.
I think the whole work life is absolutely going to change. I mean, you're already hearing about a lot of companies talking about either telling their staff, no, you're not coming back to the office until 2021, or I think, was it Schroeder's that allowed people now permanently to, there's going to be a selection and opportunity to work remotely on a permanent basis. I wouldn't want to be an investor in commercial real estate at the moment. If I think there's going to be a lot of leases once they're up, there's going to be a lot of changes.
And how about hotels? How do you think hotels are going to change?
Oh, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. I think that we're not going to stop traveling, definitely not. But I think the leisure travel is going to recover sooner than the business travel, because people are not going to want their, especially if there are quarantines or self-isolation of some kind, or just taking the risk of their senior executives, getting infected. And everyone has got so used to Zoom and the similar tools, they realized that perhaps it was more of a nice to do than a necessity in many ways. I think people will be more selective. So I think resort and holidays, yes, people will want that. And you can see with, even in the UK, with the amount of people wanting to go to France, and then now they're stuck or they're struggling to come back. But people were still desperate to get away and make, get a change of scenery, especially after being locked out inside your house for 3 months, perhaps.
You've obviously been connected to global tourism over the last few months.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any trends you're seeing particularly coming out that you are interested in?
I think the key for part of recovery for this is governments and authorities need to try to work together better. There needs to be, because we know that there's not going to be a vaccine just yet. Doesn't matter how many trials there are, and some are sounding better than others, but even if there is one, the volume of dosages that have to be produced and then getting them to people, and whether it's a single dose or a double dose after a certain, it's going to take a long time. And the priority, obviously, healthcare professionals, etc. I think we have to learn to live with this. So we have to find ways. And a lot of places, Iceland included, are testing on arrival. I think, for instance, it would be much better if people can have a test that they can be tested before they leave. So that if you're going on holiday and you test before you go, you suddenly find you are ill, you're not stuck in a foreign country, or potentially, have to isolate or not allowed to do something, and you've arrived. I think that's much better. At the moment, a lot of authorities and airports and governments, etc., are not accepting tests unless they're done by themselves. And Iceland is one of those as well. They don't accept tests. Even if you test before you leave, they won't take that. It's not valid at the moment. And I think that's a problem, because also it will speed things through airports if you can show that test on arrival, instead of airports having to find ways to put aside space to keep people social distant and be tested on arrival. So I think that's one thing. Definitely, there needs to be some uniformity in that. It's a bit like after 9/11, there was no working together on what are the rules about what liquids, or whether you take your laptops out of and has to take your shoes off, take your belt off. It's still to this day, it's inconsistent. You can make one journey and go through 2 airports or 3 airports, and it's never the same. There's lack of that consistency to help the travel and encouraging them to feel like this is smooth and simple, and I can be safe and travel.
Yeah, one of my hopes as we come out of this, service. People think differently about service as well. Services are a whole new energy coming through again.
Yeah. I think there's going to be a lot of small details that we'll have to forego for now in terms of, housekeeping and especially I would say luxury hotels. There's some of the attention to detail they're just not going to be able to. But at the same time, also some of the economy ones will have to invest more, because the cleanliness for people to feel comfortable. I'd be curious to see what happens with things like Airbnb. I would personally have more confidence in cleaning protocols for a big international hotel chain than a cleaning of someone's second home.
Look, actually, I agree with you. I was interested, but I was talking to people last week, and they were saying how good Airbnb is.
Yeah, I can see a lot of people like doing it. You can see there's a lot of people prefer to go and stay in a villa in south of France than stay in a hotel. I can understand that, but I would want to know what the cleaning protocols are, and feel confident that that's been properly cleaned, and there are some standards.
What's your biggest fear about starting up again, or do you have a concern about starting up again?
We all have to take responsibility for our own measures. I think that's the biggest piece. We can't rely on other people. Like, I go on the tube now and I wear a mask, and then I see other people, they have the mask and it's down at their chin, or it doesn't only cover their mouth and not their nose. And those kind of things irritate me, because it's up on everyone. Each and one of us are responsible to do our bits, and it only works if we collectively do it. So that's what I think is really necessary. Concerns, yeah, I think the concern is more about, we still don't know the after effects of those who got ill. I know quite a few people who've had COVID, some who've been on ventilators in hospital, and others who just were long time, weeks and weeks, kind of bubbling illness, and some of them are having some after effects, which I think is still so people are nervous about. It's not known. It's not like a normal flu where you get really ill and then you recover and you're okay. For a lot of people, anyway.
All right, Inga, thank you for your time today.
You're welcome.
It's really fascinating, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you very much for your time, Chris. I enjoyed seeing you again too.
Take care. Welcome back to London.
Take care. Thank you.